to me, the best power is quantitative to show, what is happening or what people think, but the qualitative really helps us understand why. And if we've learned anything from the stories I've shared, right, it's the survey will tell you accessibility is the problem. The interview will tell you what they mean when they say accessibility, right? So,
welcome to Insights Unlocked, an original podcast from User Testing, where we bring you candid conversations and stories with the thinkers, doers, and builders behind some of the most successful digital products and experiences in the world. From concept to execution.
Welcome to the Insights Unlocked podcast. I'm Nathan Isaacs, Principal Content Marketing Manager at User Testing. And our host today is Mike McDowell, one of User Testing's Principal Solutions Marketing Managers. Welcome back, Mike.
Always glad to be back. Thanks, Nathan.
And our guest today is Jeff Lash. Jeff is a seasoned product management leader and advisor, currently VP of Product Management at Insperity, with decades of experience helping B2B teams turn customer insight, voice of customer, and product strategy into better decisions and stronger outcomes. Welcome to the show, Jeff.
it's nice to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
Excellent. Well, Jeff, we just talked about this a little bit in the pre-show, but let's revisit it for the audience here. You've just had such an interesting path going from UX all the way back in 2002, usability specialist, really rare title, to research and product management, leadership, advising across industries. Would you mind walking us and the audience through really what shaped the way you think about customers, product management, and even decision-making in today's fast-paced world?
Yeah, I think maybe I was always naturally going to end up in product management, but I, like many people, did not take a straight path to it. So I, always grew up around technology. My dad had always lots of technology and computers in his home. If you can see the background on video, I got a whole bunch of old tech. So I grew up with technology, but I was never really a programmer. I just, liked it. I went to school and studied marketing in my undergrad. And this was right around the time that the web was taking off. And I was kind of anxious to start applying some of those ideas to .com and web stuff and not necessarily the quote unquote old school stuff that we were learning a lot of at school. This was back in the day, as I like to say, when knowing HTML was a very valuable skill to have, when the same person would set up the Apache server, design the graphics, write the copy, and maintain the webmaster of the site.
The webmaster, that's it.
Webmaster, yeah. And so I did that for a number of years, or I did that originally, both on the side and kind of for a year or two, let's say. And I very quickly realized, this is going to get very fragmented. There's specialization that's going to come out of this. I was not a great programmer, though I figured out how to write, CGI, bin, and PHP and all that stuff. I'd taken some art classes in college, but I was definitely not a graphic designer by any means. But somehow kind of stumbled upon this whole idea of usability and user experience and information architecture. And it just kind of clicked with me. For whatever reason, it resonated in this idea of, yes, we should be making websites and products that, are easy to use and meet the needs of users. Seems like that makes sense, but I was also experiencing so many products and websites that were not doing that. So I kind of refocused in that direction and did that for about maybe 4 or 5, 6 years. And as I was doing that, I really liked it. There was a great opportunity to, make products better, make digital products and technology better. But I also realized I was hitting a point where, I remember at one point saying to my boss, if I learn to run a usability test 10% better, how does that help the business versus if I can make the product 10% better, that's going to have a much bigger impact. And so there was an opportunity for me to move into product management at the company I was in. At the time, that was a pretty rare thing. So this was, early-ish in the 2000s. Product management was still not really well understood. More broadly, user experience was not really well understood. In my company, no one had ever moved into a product role from UX. And more broadly, that wasn't a common path. Now it's very common. But back then, that was, I would say unheard of, but it was fairly uncommon. But it made sense to me. And I remember about 2 months in to that job, kind of realizing it just clicked. And I started learning about what real product management is. And so much of it overlapped with everything that I had done up to that point. So the technology, obviously, from growing up around it, the marketing and positioning and branding stuff that I had learned in school. And then a lot of the user experience concepts, doing customer interviews and understanding needs and prioritizing and things like that. So it really, to me, is this combination of all the different things in my background. And so that, I've been doing that for 2 decades or so now, since just following along that path. So I think, long answer to your question of what shaped me, it's really those different things. Like I am probably, there's different types of product managers. Some people that come from more of a, technology background or a sales background. I come from probably more the UX and business background. Like I'm always thinking about, what can we do that would be good for our customers, but that also will be successful for the business. That's kind of my dominant mentality. There's other people that know technology better than me and even the nuances of your experience, but really it's about, I think what's really shaped me is that idea of if we can create products that are good for the customers, it will also be good for our business.
Yeah, we have very similar backgrounds. When you were talking about product management didn't really exist. We called it business analysis when I started. And, now that means something totally different. But yeah, going through the data oriented approach, like, hey, if I can improve this by 10%, if I can get this experience, this error experience 20% of the way to the mean conversion rate, things like that, it really shaped the way that I went from being that webmaster with my SQL and active server pages and Microsoft log file analyzer and all that into truly designing things, mapping out flows and running usability tests, or certainly having people do it for me was a huge change. You talk about moving into different organizations over your career. You've had to do that. You've done that a bunch of times. When we think about product management, we always think about product roadmaps, things like that. How dangerous is it really for organizations just to rely on things like a roadmap or pure reports? And when you do join a new company, what are some of the signals that you look for to say, do these guys really know what they're doing, or do they know what their customers think, or do they just think they know what their customers think?
I think one of the things that my background in UX taught me and has really helped me a lot in product management is really to ask follow-up questions. So for example, if someone says, I have a roadmap, rather than me in my head picturing what I think is a roadmap and assuming that's what they have, ask like, great, can I see that roadmap? Because roadmaps is a great example. I've seen hundreds of different roadmaps, and some of them are things I would not label as a roadmap, right? So I don't really care what someone calls it. To me, it's what is it? What does it look like? What's information on it? What's the intent of it? A great example that stuck in my head is I remember when I was in a UX role, I did a lot of work in healthcare, and I was interviewing a nurse one day, and we were talking about, she worked at a hospital that had access to our product, and I was talking to her about how often she uses it, and she's like, oh, I don't really use it a lot because of the accessibility. And I'm like, interesting. Can you tell me more? She's like, yeah, it's not accessible. Now, of course, as a UX person, I'm thinking 508 compatibility, accessibility, screen readers, font sizes, things like that. And so I said, can you tell me more about that? She said, oh yeah, your product is only available at the nurse's station. There's only one computer at the nurse's station. And a lot of times that is busy. Other people are using that computer for other things. So it's not accessible to me. So it had nothing to do with 508 accessibility or, low vision and disabilities, things like that. It was just literally, I could not access it. So to me, that story is probably over 20 years old, but it stuck with me. So when someone says, oh, roadmap or persona or requirements, I learned to not really just, I don't say take it at face value, but I like, let me see it. Let me see what it is. Because again, I've seen lots of different roadmaps. I've seen lots of different release plans and things like that. And they all might be different to different people. So I always, when I've taken a lot of roles where I've taken over existing products, or I did spend about a decade in more of a consulting advising role. And so, seeing what the team is already doing, seeing what a person's doing is a great way just to understand where they're at, not from a judgmental perspective, but just for hey, let me understand what are the artifacts you use and how do you document things? And that helps me understand the context, the industry, the product, but also how they're actually doing product development or doing product management.
I love that. I didn't see that coming, that little twist there. That's a great story. It makes me think of, I think of everything in terms of movies. White Men Can't Jump, when Wesley Snipes is explaining to Woody Harrelson, no, you can hear him, but you can listen to him, but you don't hear him. I forget, it's one way or the other. And the idea of, hearing someone say something, but not really listening to know that it means something else, like to go a little bit deeper and asking that follow-up. And so much of it is understanding the why. Like, okay, you told me what's going on, but if when you explain the why, then I'll understand, you're not talking about the fact that like, oh, you wear glasses and so you need a higher contrast or you need a higher font size. No, you literally mean I cannot access the computer to access your website. It's literally a roadblock to me. That's a great story.
Yeah. So I think, I think the artifacts are always helpful. I mean, and in fact, I will also say lack of artifacts is also helpful, right? I've been in a lot of situations where I asked to say, hey, can you show me a roadmap, requirements, business case, product overview, whatever. And that doesn't exist, or it exists in pieces. And the fact that it exists in someone's head or it exists in 10 different places scattered across the organization, that also is informative, right? It tells me like, oh, okay, so this stuff is not documented. There's not a consistent process. There's no one reviewing these. Maybe other stakeholders aren't aware of these things. So it's not that those artifacts are necessarily good or bad. It's just, I don't view it as a binary, yes, you have it, no, you don't, thumbs up, thumbs down situation.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Wow. Talking about the whole idea of having these answers and listening and joining new companies, especially today, unfortunately, there's a lot of people joining new companies all the time. What advice would you say, in someone's first 30 or 60 days at a new company, especially if they're in a leadership role, they're expected to come in and just have answers right away. When someone's got that expectation, and in your experience, how would you balance really listening more deeply to really truly understand like the nurse's station situation versus like just saying, yeah, I've got the answer. Here it is right away. Especially when, senior leadership, they want confidence they want confidence from you or whoever we're talking about here before the insights are even fully formed, before you have all the answers. How do you push back on that? What do you do?
So I think the first question is, I think that is a common assumption. I would maybe question that assumption. I'm sure in some situations this is right. I've seen literally job descriptions where it says, in the first 30 days, you will do this. In the first 60 days, you'll do this. I think in other situations, we assume, oh, I've got to come in and I've got to shake things up and make my mark. And I don't know if that's always necessarily true. Either way, getting a good understanding of the organization, of the people, of the industry, if you're new to the industry, to the company, right? That's really important. And I think a lot of people, hiring is a risky decision, right? So how do you mitigate that risk? You try to do all your legwork beforehand, but also you try to, I think, as a new person coming in, you're trying to say, oh, you made a good decision. I don't necessarily think coming in and saying, here's my plan is always the right way to do that. I think listening is a really important way. So every role I've had, going around meeting people, spending time with them, treating it like a customer research project, right? Like you should not be talking 90% of the time. You should be talking 10% of the time, right? Asking people questions, building trust, building that relationship to get them to share things, to open up, to be confident, asking them what they think you should do and what you shouldn't do. I took one role where I did that. It was a small company. I didn't really need to do a whole lot of digging. I went around and talked to about a dozen people, and it was pretty clear what was going on in the company. And everyone consistently said, here's the 3 things that we need to work on. So I was able to go back to management and say, here's the 3 things we need to work on. Now, I layered my own judgment on that, but I think in that case, they had a pretty good pulse on what's going on. So I think that's one thing. Secondly is, it also really depends on the situation. If you are taking over a product that is doing well, that is very different than taking over a product that is failing. If you're taking over a product that is not yet in the market versus one that's very mature. If the business is successful, it's not. If there's changes going on. So I think that really depends. If you're in a situation where they hired you to do a turnaround, yeah, I think you probably need to come in with a 30, 60, 90-day plan. But if things are in more stable shape and it was, someone left, we need a new person, doesn't mean that you should just keep things running automatically. But it also means that, making the decision to keep going with things it might be the right thing in some cases.
Yeah.
I think sometimes the last thing I'll just say is, I think a lot of it also depends on the manager, right? It's like, people ask me, do I need an MBA for product management? And my answer is like, well, depends on your hiring manager. Because if your hiring manager has an MBA, they might want to hire an MBA. If they don't like MBAs, they won't, right? So if the person who hired you, if your boss is expecting you to come in with a plan, then yeah, you got to have a plan. If they're not pushing that, then, not to say the pressure is off, but it's not as coming in with that, like, I've got to do something right away, doesn't seem as urgent than maybe you think it is.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's really interesting. The higher up you go, sometimes that 30 or 60 days starts before your first day, actually. And you got hired because they expected you to have a plan already. We were talking a lot there about the voice of the employee, really, like figuring out what's going on, where are we, what's the situation. And let's pivot that onto the voice of the customer and think about, and I mentioned how you are you were on the circuit, right? You've done a lot of talks out there in the day. And, one of the things you've talked about is voice of the customer. And it's not just about volume of feedback. A lot of companies have lots of different channels of different things that are coming in. And, some of it is self-selected, people who complain, people who write in, stuff like that. How does a really good, strong team decide which signals, which channels of customer or voice of customer they should trust, and which ones maybe intentionally ignore those in favor of the other ones?
Yeah, I've spent most of my career in B2B, and I think, and not, necessarily large scale B2B where, you've got like millions and millions of customers, but situations where, it might be thousands of customers or tens of thousands, right? So it's a somewhat more targeted market in some cases. I think in a lot of cases, there are frontline people that really actually have a pretty good pulse on what's going on. If we're talking about an existing product, an existing portfolio, because they're hearing day to day what they're struggling with. Sales is not always, 100% correct, but I think a lot of times they have a pretty good pulse on, hey, here's the questions I'm getting asked, or here's the competitors we're losing out to. Now, how we fix that is a product management job, but talking with sales, talking with customer success, technical support, if you have got an implementation team or services team, right? I think those are really good sources. It doesn't mean we're going to just verbatim take what they say as fact. We've got to assess it against other things. So some things I like to think about is, number one, what is our target market? Because a lot of times I've found, there we go, thumbs up. A lot of times I've found that we're getting feedback requests for features or things like that from customers that are not in our target market. So that begs the question of, do we want those customers as a target market? Because that's the first question. So if we've already said, hey, we're going after market A and all this feedback is coming up from market B and we don't care about market B, that's really easy. But sometimes you have to raise that question to the leadership and say, hey, I know you've told us that market segment A is our target, but we've got a lot of customers in market segment B. And they're giving us a lot of feedback. So we need some guidance. Like, do we care about them or not? Or how do we care about their importance? So I think that can be one real good kind of sifting factor, litmus test first. I think the second is also personas, right? So understanding the different personas, especially again in B2B, we've got lots of different buyer personas and user personas that are interacting with our product or with the buying process. So understanding the relative importance of those, especially when you're trying to make a switch, when we're saying, hey, we used to sell this product into IT, now we're trying to sell it into marketing. We used to sell this to small businesses, now we're trying to sell to enterprises. I think understanding, all feedback is not equal. So I found those two factors are really helpful just to narrow it down. And then you start looking at volume, intensity, things like that.
That you just hit on it right there. Sometimes there's a trend of feedback that over time, maybe the first few times it was just a small bit of feedback. And then over time, it really morphs into something that's really important. I'll give you an example. When I worked, I spent the vast majority of my career working for Hertz, the Cardinal company. And I worked on their website from when it was just brochureware all the way up until 2019. And at one point, every month we would meet with our customer support team and they would give us sort of like this curated list of these are the top themes of the issues that are being reported to us. And we started seeing this complaint that said, or not a complaint, but a comment that said, hey, I'd really like to add my reservation to my calendar. Like just after I make a reservation, can you have me add it to the calendar? And we were always kind of like, at the time anyways, well, that's post-transactional. That doesn't make us any money. So we're not going to do that. Like, well, that's a lower priority. It's there, but it's low. And then one month that changed, that comment changed and it morphed into, how come you're the only Cardinal company that doesn't let me add my reservation to my calendar? And then it was like, oh no, now we're at a competitive disadvantage. We need to, that commentary just went a lot higher. Now, if we'd been doing a bit more active listening, we probably would have got ahead of that. But still, it's just one of those things where the people, that channel, where it's coming from, is important. And you also said something really important, which is sometimes you got to say no to a customer. Or there's the concept of firing a customer if they're not the right customer. Like you have to say, yes, I understand that you really want this, but that's not us. We're not going to do that. We're focused over here. And that actually leads into this other question that I was thinking of. Teams get caught up between like putting out daily fires versus really just understanding what the customers need, what the roadmap should look like. And at the end of the month, I go, where did all the time go? Oh, we were just doing all these little things. We were just putting out all these little fires that didn't really matter. In your opinion, when you think about a sustainable voice of customer cadence, how does that actually look for a senior product leader in affecting the day-to-day, what they're doing?
I think a lot of what you're describing happens because a lot of times products are developed or managed from the bottoms up, right? Like, hey, we got a bunch of stuff in the backlog. We got a bunch of VOC feedback coming in. We got a bunch of sales requests. All right, let's prioritize those and just add them to the queue. And then it's just this hamster wheel that you keep running on, and you look and you're like, did we really do anything, or did it have impact? So this is where a top-down approach is really needed. So understanding, what is the vision for before even the product, what's the vision for the company, right? What's the company strategy? What's the organizational imperatives? What are the priorities, near term and long term? What is then the portfolio strategy? What is the product strategy or vision, right? It's kind of a pyramid kind of moving down. So when we get to the point where we say, hey, we've got 20 different pieces of feedback, rather than just saying, well, this one seems important, but this one's yelling really loud and this is a big customer over here, you can say, all right, let's look at those priorities and goals and measure up that way. It doesn't mean that 100% of the time you're going to line things up, and you always have those situations where we make an exception for one big customer that we want to save, or the CEO says, hey, I got to do this, or but I think as much as possible, trying to start for that hand up and say, all right, and making it obvious that you're making a conscious decision. I was working with one client where I was kind of coaching them through this whole process and basically saying, look, like the CEO every week was asking for something new. And I said, all right, like you need to, as a product leader, like be enabled to have that discussion with your CEO to say, hey, look, last week you told us X, Y, and Z were priorities. Our customers are saying A, B, and C are priorities. Now you're telling us to do D, E, and F. Like, help me prioritize. We can't do it all. So like what's most important, and kind of showcasing when we're going to make the do an audible and like overrule it. Like, it's fine if it's 1% of the time or 5% of the time, but if it's 50% of the time, that's where you start getting problems. So I think that's where VOC fits in, right? If we understand those the bigger vision, that's overall strategy for the product, the roadmap, then we can say, all right, like what areas do we have enough customer insight captured, and what areas do we need to maybe dig into more? My view is there's always an ongoing monitoring of the product you need, but usually there are spikes, right? We say, hey, we're going to be working on a scheduling module next because we know people need scheduling. We've heard that over and over, but we need lots more insights on how exactly scheduling should work. So let's do a kind of focused effort into really digging into that. That doesn't mean we stop the ongoing VOC work we're doing. It just means we're going to put a little extra emphasis kind of for a specific project where we need more insights.
And what do you think the line is there where a team has to realize, hey, we're relying too much on those secondhand insights that are sort of coming into us versus proactively going and running their own research on something that they want to do?
Yeah, I wish there was a formula you could just plug numbers in and say, yes or no. I generally look at it as based on, think of an XY kind of graph of like level of, trying to think of the right dimensions here. Kind of the cost of making a wrong decision and the level of confidence we need, right? So if I'm just saying, hey, we're going to add a button because people have been asking for a button to, export this to Excel, right? So if I'm just doing that, I might say, look, we've got a couple pieces of feedback. We know people are asking for it. Great. That's enough confidence. But if we're saying, hey, we're going to launch a whole new product that we're going to invest millions of dollars over the next X number of months for, like, I want a much higher level of confidence. So I think that's where the art and science kind of mix together. So the harder a decision is to reverse, the more time and money we're going to put in, the more risk there is if we make the wrong decision. I think that's where you want a higher level of confidence. So I think the other thing is we're never going to have perfect information. And so product managers need to be comfortable making decisions on imperfect information, but also thinking about, right, what if I'm wrong? How are we going to change it, or just accepting the fact that, hey, we're not going to get it perfect the first time, so we need to have a plan for addressing it. Hopefully we're at least moving most of the way in the right direction, but recognizing that this is not, the perfect product in version 1. Like, let's get to here. Do we have enough confidence to get us that first step, and then enough confidence that that first step will be good enough for our clients, our customers, and then a plan to iterate it after that.
All right. For everyone who's listening, I hope Jeff is after my own heart here. So I hope you understood what he said just there. If you're starting a new big project, a new initiative, something that is not in the market yet, get research done on it as early as possible. You definitely want to stop working on something that doesn't make sense to customers. They don't want it. They don't care about it. It's not a competitive advantage. Do that as early as possible. So I loved hearing you say that. And since that was sort of almost like a grand statement, I'm going to ask you to sort of exude your inner oracle for the moment, as people are going to really need help with this one. And this is a bit of conflict resolution internal at orgs, which is, it's not, I don't want to say ever present, but usually it is. Let's say you're getting feedback from sales or support or one of these other channels, and it conflicts with what you're hearing directly from customers when you do your own research. How do you help teams sort of reconcile the differences without sort of eroding trust or breaking down relationships in your organization?
I'll pause here and give you my oracle, do my best to channel it. So I would want to first start with understanding what the differences are. When you get feedback from sales, it's generally one of two things. It's, this is what I think I need to close the next deal, or this is why I think I lost the last deal, right? They generally are, especially at individual sales contributor levels, they're very focused on like my specific opportunities, my specific pipeline. The higher up you go in the sales organization, they usually, in most cases, have a much broader view. So it's not just one deal or the last deal, but it's like, hey, here's a pattern we're seeing. So if I'm getting that feedback from an individual salesperson, I might say, well, I might not put as much stock in it as it is if it's a VP or CSO. I want to dig into it a little bit more. I'd maybe share with, and I'm just spitballing here, like I might want to share with them, hey, look, you're telling me X, I'm hearing Y. Can you let's talk about why we think we're hearing difference. I might want to talk with some of those customers directly, right? You told me this client wanted X. Can I talk with them? And in many cases, salespeople are happy. They actually really love when someone from headquarters, quote unquote, is willing to go talk to a client or to a prospect. So not that I don't trust the salesperson, but I want to understand in that client's own words why they're meeting. Actually, it's your nursing station story again. Years ago, I was working on a product that was very search heavy. It was a content product, and we did a major redesign of the product for many reasons. In the old version of the product, there was the ability, like on many search systems, to like jump to the next page. And there was a button to jump to the last page of search results. And we looked at the analytics and we saw that was very rarely used. And we talked to our users and asked them how they did searches. And they explained, like most normal people do, 90% of the time I look at the first page and I never go past that. So we said, we don't need the jump to the last page of search results button. That's unnecessary. So we did a redesign. We got rid of it. Of course, like the next week, what happens? Sales manager calls me up and said, "Oh my gosh, Jeff, I've got this big customer. They're super upset. That jump to the last button of search results button is missing. You got to add it back in. You got to add it back in." And I said, "That's really interesting. Can I talk to them to learn more?" And they said, "Sure." So I go talk to the customer. It turns out it was a content product, and there was the ability to buy extra modules of content besides the standard. This customer was using that button to check and make sure that all the content they had purchased was available to them. So their need was not jump to the end of the search results. Their need was, I want to make sure that all the content I purchased is available. I was able to say, oh, actually, we introduced a new feature. Here's this page and here's this list. And I also, and they were able to go and see, oh yes, here's the things I've purchased, and validate that they actually had access to them. It also taught me, we maybe didn't make that page prominent enough. And so it's a great example of, it's not that the salesperson was wrong. It's not that the customer was wrong. It was just how they were what they said they needed was not really fundamentally what they needed. I think a lot of cases it comes back to that underlying. Very rarely have I seen a situation where what we hear from our VOC research and what we hear through sales and CS are, 180 degrees apart. It's more like, 5% different or, some nuances in the difference. So I think transparency, engaging those people in conversation, sharing, hey, here's what I heard. How's this different? And then let's try to figure out, it may be that again, oh, you're getting feedback from one segment of customers. We did research with a different segment. You're hearing from these personas. We're hearing from different personas. And trying to figure out like, where is the difference? And if there really is a difference, then that might be where we need to do more research. But in most cases, I found that it's usually comes down to details like that, where it's just, we're asking different questions or we're talking to different types of people.
It comes right back to the thing you mentioned earlier, which is just asking follow-up questions. And unfortunately, to your point, sometimes sales doesn't know the right follow-up questions to ask. You do have to get that product person or the person from HQ to come in and say, tell me more about that. And again, I started over talking before, but it sounded a lot like the situation with your nurses station story. Like, let me just ask one more question on top of that accessibility thing.
Yeah. In fairness, like, that's not sales' job. So I'm not upset that they didn't ask the question. That is not their job. Absolutely. Like they are doing what they are paid to do and what we ask them to do. So yes, there are times where salespeople will ask more questions and they'll bring back great insight. And I've worked with great people like that, but I'm not expecting them to. I think, like I said, sometimes you'll start to see patterns. And that's really where a good partnership is it really important, right? Whether it's sales, whether it's technical support, customer success, whatever that group is, right? They're just doing what they're doing as part of their job, and they're going to gather insight as part of that. It's our job to assess that, filter it, see if we need to dig in more and understand how to use it.
100%. It seems like what we're talking about here is a little bit of a mindset change, a little bit of a mindset shift from just taking it at face value. Customer said it, we have to do it, to investing a little bit more, bringing more people in. A lot of people will think, oh, we have a process problem here. We're not listening. We're not getting feedback. But really, it's sort of maybe more of a mindset change of, no, we listened, but now we need to go back and we need to dig deeper on that. How do you, basically when you look at those issues, do you see a lot of mindset issues that really get disguised as process problems that people are talking about? They're not really looking at them the right way?
So I see mindset issues that are disguised as process problems. Yes, definitely. The short answer is yes. I think one great example that I've dealt with a lot is prioritization, right? So people talk about, we don't have a process for prioritization, or, we can't agree or whatever. And the reality is, like, maybe it's just that your roles and responsibilities aren't clear. So let's talk about, I'm imagining a lot of the people listening to this or watching this are in user experience design, product design roles, right? Product design versus product management usually has a very good relationship, but sometimes it's not clear. So when we have discussions or debates about, you're not following the right process, or you're not, the process isn't clear, maybe just at the end of the day, someone makes a decision on something. And in many cases for a product decision, that's the product manager, but it should be influenced by the product designer or UX person. So I think that is something where I like to say, I deal with this a lot of people when they ask about technology, when we're working with technology. Like, a good piece of technology can support a good process, but if you don't have a good process, then a piece of technology can't fix that. I think the same thing for, a good process can help reinforce and support the right mindset, the right roles and responsibilities. But if you don't have that fundamental understanding, just slapping a process on top of it is not going to fix things.
Yeah, I lit up when you said prioritization, because in my experience, that's always the hardest thing, because it's got the most players involved. Sometimes you got really loud voices, you got some hippos, you got some whoever, everyone's trying to get things done. And really, truly being voice of customer centric and letting your customer help supersede a lot of that is a huge mindset change. And whereas everyone thinks it's like, oh, the process doesn't work. We've got all these, we can't get you guys can't listen, you can't hear, you can't set priorities quarterly. It's tough to set priorities quarterly, right? When everyone's fighting fires every day and getting calls from the CEO's kid telling you they didn't like something and you need to change it.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times that voice of the customer can be the great equalizer. So I'll give you one example. Well, to think of two examples. One where I worked on the product actually when I was in a UX role years ago, and another where I was advising a company. So when I was in a product, I was in a product in a UX role years ago, and working with a product manager who had a very, very specific opinion about how the product should work. This opinion was not based on any data or facts. It was just based on that person's opinion. And they were a smart, bright, successful person at the company. So, of course, they think like, oh, well, I have this opinion. It's right. So rather than arguing with them and tell them why they're wrong, I went out and we did a bunch of research and came back with some data. And then we did more research and I brought that person along with me, right? So they could see and hear the stuff firsthand. And it wasn't that they were completely wrong. It's just they were, they thought people wanted, X, Y, and Z in that order. And it really turned out X was not important and Z was more important, right? So it was kind of a bit of a shift. And so I didn't tell them that they were wrong. I didn't tell them that this is not what customers want. I let them learn that for themselves, right? So, and it was, look, and if they were right and the customer data supported that, all the better. Like I'm fine with that as well, right? So it's not about me trying to prove them they're wrong. It was just, I was pretty sure based on what I knew about our clients, this wasn't work, right? So that was a great, and I've actually done that a lot. I'm sure a lot of your listeners have done that as well, like clips, video of clients, of interviews, quotes I use all the time. I've done things where I've brought customers to our offices. When I was a product management role, I brought physicians to our offices. We would do like lunch and learns, and I would just interview physicians and I'd invite other people from the company, from the product to just sit and listen. Many of whom have never actually talked with this was a healthcare product, who never talked with like a doctor. They talk with a doctor like when they go to the doctor, but they never heard a doctor talk about our product. And so it was really just enlightening and they loved it. People always wanted to participate. So I think it's not about telling someone they're wrong or proving you're right or wrong. It's like, let's let the voice of customer be the great equalizer. I worked with a client who had the same problem. It was a CEO and a head of product with a small company. The CEO would get an idea on a Friday and tell the head of product, oh my gosh, you got to start doing this. And the CEO was also the founder and engineer number one. So he was thinking, oh, why are you dragging your feet on this? I can just go build this, And so what I told the head of product, I said, do you think you can buy yourself a week? I know the CEO is in a rush, but do you think you can buy yourself a week? And the head of product said, yes. So I said, this was actually a product that was sold through partners. I said, take that week, go and interview a couple of your partners, ask them, get their feedback. The partners were like the sales channel. So they were really implementing the product. They were respected. And so the head of product was able to do some just quick informal, hey, I'll make a phone call, talk to someone, come back. And the next Friday, go to the CEO and say, hey, I know you told me to do this, but just so you know, I talked to 5 of our partners and they said they'd rather have something else, or they said they had these concerns. And it started, doing that week after week for a couple of months, like started to kind of loosen that process. So yes, the CEO clearly had a vision and was still pushing things, but it was not charging forward at full force without any respect to what the market wanted. It was starting to understand, yes, like we don't need to go quite so fast. And in fact, if we slow down a little bit and make sure we're building the right things and not building the wrong things, it's going to be more successful. So I think it's not that stuff doesn't happen overnight, but just with a little bit of time and again, bringing users, customers, partners into the process and having their words speak for themselves can sometimes get everyone on a level playing field.
Yeah, I think I remember way back in the day, I think that was sort of like the Amazon way. Like people would email like Jeff@Amazon.com and he would get these feedback over the weekend and, really some of them were great ideas. I mean, some of them maybe weren't. I'm sure he could tell the difference, but, they've done pretty well for themselves. But yeah, that's kind of that model that you're talking about. I think maybe we're rounding third here. I think you've already maybe touched on this and now we're just going to sort of revisit it. But you've told a lot of stories today about a lot of different companies. You worked with hundreds of product teams in different industries. What's like the one habit that really separates teams that learn fast and other teams that are just like stuck in one spot, even when both claim to be customer centric? They have it in their mission statement. Oh, we listen, voice of customer. What's that one skill maybe that separates them?
I'm rather than a skill, I think I'm going to more talk about kind of a mindset. You mentioned mindset earlier. I think that's actually the biggest thing. I think there's, I think the teams that are most successful have a growth mentality. I hope everyone understands this idea of growth mentality rather than, I've seen a lot of teams that are really good at providing explanations. not excuses, but explanations. Oh, well, yeah, we wanted to do that, but here's why we didn't do that. Or, hey, yeah, this is the reason why the product is set up this way. And we tried to do that and it didn't happen. Like, I that's great, but like, let's focus on all right, so given that, what can we do better? There's always constraints. There's always politics or people, whatever you want to call it. I think the people that are most successful are thinking about, all right, how can we make this better? And in spite of what happened in the past, in spite of what is happening today, in spite of constraints we have, what can we do in being creative? The great example of Apollo 11, right, where it's like they dump the things on the table, like, right, make it work. We got to figure out a way. Like, you can say, oh, we don't have enough time, or we should have, this isn't a good request, or like we wish we had more resources. But the reality is, like, this is what we've got. And I think the teams that are most successful are always thinking about, right, what can we do with what we have, rather than spending their time explaining or grumbling about why things are not the case. And I think that means that leads to more innovation, that leads maybe to more testing and experimenting. And also this need to never be 100% happy with your product, right? Like, it's always tough when someone calls your baby ugly. I've developed products from scratch. I've taken over products from scratch. I really love the products I've built, but I don't think I've ever said this product is perfect, right? It's always been like, all right, like, it was good, now it's better. Like, I think it can be even better and better, right? And just continuing to evolve. And your example earlier about the car reservation, like, even if you build the quote unquote perfect product, some competitor comes along and does something else, right? And then the market changes. So I think that growth mindset and that ability to kind of continue looking forward rather than explaining why we are where we are, using that energy to figure out how to improve it, I think is probably the biggest difference.
Yeah, I think the Apollo 13 example you gave there, a lot of people they focus on the expression think outside the box. It's like, no, yes, but what can you do inside the box that no one's thinking of? And what can you do with what you have? That makes just a huge difference if you look at those pieces.
We're recording this during the Winter Olympics. So I've got a great Olympic story I heard yesterday. I'm sure I'm going to get the details wrong, but the message hopefully is there. So the skeleton, right, which is that you're on a sled head first going down the track. So the American team and the Canadian team, I guess years ago, like trained together. They were going to be training together. The Americans go up to Canada and they bring this, they had millions of dollars of R&D and all this aerodynamic equipment or whatever that they were just, and a big part, like 50% of success in the skeleton and illusion bobsled is the start. Like, if you can get a good start going, that sets you up for success. And then the rest of it is steering. The Americans were beating the Canadians off the start. And so the Canadian coach apparently said, there's no way we can beat them trying to compete with them because they have so much better equipment. The equipment, aerodynamics, whatever. He took the skeleton racers and said, like, all right, go off and figure out a way we can beat them off the start. And then came up with this new technique. And if you watch now, what at the time happened was everyone was doing the skeleton with two hands. Like, you put your two hands on the sled, you run behind it, and then you jump. The Canadians, I guess, were the first ones to come up with the idea of like holding with one hand, running alongside, so your other hand can be pumping. Like, if you're running, right, you have your arms move, and then jumping on the sled, kind of sliding over and jumping on the sled. They were the first ones to develop that, and like they started winning all these races, and then everyone else basically followed suit. So to me, that's a great example of, yes, they might have more money, they might have more, R&D or behind it, but like saying, all right, how can we think outside the box, quote unquote, think out a way to do this better. And like that turned out it worked. And then, eventually the Americans and everyone caught on and they didn't get that advantage. But again, it's just, to me, that's coming back to this. If we just change our mindset rather than saying, oh, we don't have as much money, we need more funding, we need more R&D, just saying, all right, can we completely look at this? And is there a way to do it differently that was in front of our noses all the time that we just missed?
Yeah. I love that story. It makes me think of the Jamaican bobsledders. Let's get some track stars to try to get that fast start to go off the line. Let's circle back to, this is another one that I think all the product management folks are going to really get value in. You've been very, very, very passionate about this particular topic. Roadmaps. We'll go back to roadmaps just real quick. Again, we're doing a couple of these like one thing to wrap this up. The way that roadmaps are communicated perhaps is the single biggest downfall of product teams and how they're viewed internally in organizations. What is the thing that senior leaders do today that makes roadmaps harder to use as like a learning tool and a tool for the field to actually benefit from?
Yeah, so I've done a lot of research out there. People can look there. This was a topic when I was at Serious Decisions. We did a lot of research and I did a bunch of presentations. So I think there's a couple of recordings online where I give like some tips. I think the most important thing that people don't do, that is the downfall with roadmaps, is think about their audience. One of the most common things I see is that people take a roadmap that is designed for engineering and use that for other audiences, right? What engineers and developers want to see is a detailed, timeline, because they're thinking, what resources do we need? What technology do we need? What team's going to be available? Capacity, all this sort of stuff. What a board member is thinking, what the CEO is thinking, what a customer is thinking is not that. It's, hey, like, where is this product going? When will this feature be available? Like, what is the value of this thing to me? So I think there's a bunch of tips I've got out there, but I think that to me is the one. I think the people who, again, another client story. I had a client I was working with that was the head of, he was actually a CTPO before that term was even recognized. He was head of product and engineering. And he presented his roadmap to his senior management team and like, they didn't like it and had a lot of objections and asked a lot of questions. I said, okay, great. Like, let's set up a call. Show me your roadmap. And within 10 seconds, I knew exactly what was wrong. He was an engineering guy. He was a technical guy by nature. So his roadmap was like organized around the different technology platforms and engineering teams. And it made complete sense to him. And it made no sense to the head of sales or head of marketing or head of, partners or whatever. And so basically I helped him take that roadmap. I didn't change the things on the roadmap because I don't know his industry. We just changed the way he presented it, the words he used, the way it was organized. He went back and presented it to his management team and they loved it. It was the exact same roadmap. It was just, to your point, how he was communicating it and presenting it. So he was thinking about himself as the audience instead of thinking about these other non-technical people as the audience. So if I had to give people one tip, that would be, because I think then so many other decisions just get based.
You've said it a couple of times, know your audience.
Yeah.
And it holds true no matter what kind of presentation or thing you're presenting to anybody. Always know your audience. All right. This is the last one of these, just one thing, questions I've got for you, and then we'll wrap it up. But, again, we've covered a lot of different topics, during the conversation today. You've worked in product management. You started in UX, voice of customer, advisory, consulting. What is the one belief about customer insights that you really wish would change because customers and organizations are still getting it wrong? What is that one thing maybe that you see as a through line that you'd like to see change?
Ooh. One thing. I don't know if this is the biggest one, but maybe it's the one that I've encountered the most during my career. I think this is getting better, but I remember dealing with this a lot, maybe 10 plus years ago, and even now it's still a bit. Qualitative insights are valuable. I think so much of this is, we had, 2 customers asked for this, or 10 customers asked for this, or we ran a survey and these numbers, or we did A/B testing. I mean, there's so many technologies and platforms that make it possible to do so much more rapid experimentation and gather data quickly. And that is super valuable. But, one insight from one customer can have the light bulb can go off. These stories I've been sharing, like some of these, again, have stuck with me for 10, 15, 20 years. It doesn't mean I would make a whole change in product strategy based on one customer, but I remember, working on stuff when I was in UX, and we would come back and do a lot of, one-on-one interviews and observational research. And people would be like, well, you only talked to 8 people. I'm like, yeah, but I talked to 8 people and they were representative users and none of them liked this idea. Right. So like, I can go talk to 20 more, but I'm pretty sure that all 20 of them, like, they were not an anomaly. So I think I've seen that change, but I think there still is a lot of reliance on only quantitative or like prioritizing quantitative. And I think understanding that quantitative and qualitative both have a purpose. And there are times where, you might be over emphasizing one at the expense of the other. And that, to me, the best power is quantitative to show, what is happening or what people think, but the qualitative really helps us understand why. And if we've learned anything from the stories I've shared, right, it's, the survey will tell you accessibility is the problem. The interview will tell you what they mean when they say accessibility, right? So
I need to promise everyone that I have no idea what Jeff was going to say as the answer to that question. I didn't know he was going to talk about qualitative feedback, but I certainly love that answer. Qualitative is super powerful. And, I used to sit behind two-way mirrors to get that just a few people to see what they would say. It can unlock so many possibilities because someone who doesn't know as much as you see something, their knee-jerk reaction is just, oh, well, that's really weird. I thought that looked like this. And you're like, wait, what? You thought it looked like this instead of that? So huge. Jeff, I just want to say thank you so much for being on the show. This was such a fun conversation. I always like talking to an OG. I love the conversation. How does someone learn more about you, your thought leadership? You mentioned there's a lot of things online, but how can someone find more about the work you're doing and the team are doing at Insperity?
Yeah. So a couple of ways. Probably the best thing to do is to follow me on LinkedIn. It's just linkedin.com/in/Jeff Lash. I'm doing something in 2026, which is posting a product management tip every day. I did this in 2021. I did it in 2023, and I figured it was time to do it again. Not using AI, by the way. This is all like handwritten. Maybe using AI a little bit just to clean it up. But so if you like this stuff, it's just a simple, short product management tip in your feed every day. You can also find me at jefflash.com. That has links to a bunch of other podcasts and blog posts and things like that. And then, my day job, quote unquote, what I'm doing at Insperity is really we're supporting small businesses, helping them grow and succeed and helping the communities they serve through HR services and technology. So if you're a small business and you're interested in how Insperity might be able to help you, insperity.com is the best way to reach out.
Excellent. And your tip from yesterday is one I have to be better at, which is stop just answering everybody and instead point them to where the answers live. Send them to the knowledge base, send them to, the intranet area that's got these things. That's one that I fall victim to. I answer people more often than I send them to where the answers are. So really, really great. Jeff, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed the conversation and, glad to be a part of it.
Excellent.